The deed was still warm from the merchant's hands when Clara realized she had made a terrible mistake. She stood at the edge of a dirt road that had long since surrendered to weeds, her worn leather boots sinking slightly into the soft earth left behind by the morning rain. The parchment in her fingers trembled, not from the wind, though there was plenty of it, cutting cold through the gray wool of her cloak and pulling loose strands from her long blonde braid. It trembled because her hands had not quite stopped shaking since the day she had walked away from everything she had ever known. 3 silver coins. That was all she had paid for the property. 3 silver coins and a signature she had made without asking a single question, because the merchant had smiled too widely and spoken too quickly, and she had been too exhausted to think clearly, too hungry, too desperate to believe that something, anything, could finally go right. Now she understood why no one else had bid. The house, if it could still be called that, crouched at the end of the overgrown path like something that had given up on itself. Vines had consumed it entirely, thick dark ropes of them climbing every wall, swallowing the window frames, curling over what remained of the thatched roof. The wooden door had warped so severely that it no longer touched its own frame on the left side, leaving a gap through which cold air and dead leaves whispered freely. The stone foundation, once no doubt solid, had cracked in 2 places she could see from the road, and the small garden to the side was nothing but a tangle of thorns and frost-blackened stems. Clara pressed her lips together. She had cried enough. She had decided that on the road, 3 days ago, when she had finally left the territory of the Greywood pack behind her and felt the bond, that horrible, hollow bond, snap completely silent in her chest. She was 23 years old. She was an Omega without a pack, and she was standing in front of a ruin she now legally owned. There was no one left to cry to. She walked forward. The gate, a rusted iron thing barely hanging from one hinge, gave a sound like a wounded animal when she pushed it open. The path through the garden was nearly invisible beneath the overgrowth, but her boots found the old stones beneath the mud, and she followed them to the warped door. She pressed her palm flat against the wood. It groaned. She pushed harder. It scraped across the stone threshold and swung open into darkness and the heavy, damp smell of years of neglect, old timber, cold ash, something faintly sweet beneath it all, like dried herbs long forgotten. She stepped inside. The single room was dim, the vine-covered windows letting in only thin threads of pale light. A stone hearth dominated the far wall, its mouth dark and full of old ash. A rough wooden table stood crookedly near the center, one leg propped up with a folded piece of bark. A sleeping pallet in the corner had long since become a nest for field mice, the straw scattered and chewed. But the walls were stone, thick and solid, and when Clara pressed her hand against them, she felt no give, no rot. It could be saved. She exhaled slowly and set her small pack down on the table, testing its weight before trusting the wood. It held. She looked up at the ceiling and found the thatch damaged, but not collapsed. Cold, yes. Dark, yes. Smelling of abandonment and mouse and damp earth, but standing. She went back outside to gather firewood before the light failed completely. That was when she heard the horse. Not the gentle sound of a traveling merchant or a farmer heading home before dark. This was the heavy, deliberate rhythm of a war horse, hooves striking the road with the kind of authority that made the ground itself pay attention. Clara straightened from where she had crouched to pick up a fallen branch and turned toward the road. There were 4 of them, riders in dark leathers, cloaks the color of midnight, moving in a tight formation that spoke of discipline and purpose. Royal Guard, her mind said immediately, reading the silver wolf head clasps at their throats. But it was the man at the center who made her breath catch. He was enormous. Not merely tall, though he was that, but built in the way of someone who had never in his life needed to make himself smaller to fit a room. His black braided hair fell past his shoulders. several thinner braids framing a face that was all sharp angles and quiet danger, a jaw darkened by a short beard, eyes so deeply blue they were almost black in the fading light, a faint scar running along his left cheekbone that somehow only made the stillness of his expression more unnerving. He wore a leather breastplate crossed with thick straps, heavy brassideras on his forearms, and across his broad shoulders, a cloak of black wolf fur that moved like shadow when the wind touched it. He was looking directly at her. Clara did not move. She had learned, in the pack she had left, that Omegas who moved too quickly around powerful alphas sometimes did not get to explain themselves afterward. So she stood very still with a piece of firewood in her hands and met his gaze, which was perhaps the second mistake she had made that day. His warhorse stopped at the rusted gate. One of the guards leaned forward and said something low that Clara could not hear. The man, the Alpha, unmistakably, did not look away from her. His blue eyes swept once, briefly, over the ruined house behind her, then returned to her face with an expression she could not read at all. "You are on Dravenmore land," he said. His voice was quiet. That was the most alarming part. She had expected a shout, a command, the bark of an alpha asserting territory. Instead, his words were low and measured, the kind of quiet that did not need volume because it already owned everything within earshot. Clara lifted her chin. "I purchased this property this morning," she said, and was proud that her voice did not shake. "From a merchant in the village of Ashvin. I have the deed." Something shifted in his expression, not softening. Nothing about this man suggested softness, but a flicker of something she could not name crossed behind those cold blue eyes. "There is no merchant in Ashvin with the right to sell this land," he said. The piece of firewood felt suddenly very heavy in her hands. "Then," she said carefully, "I was deceived." He looked at her for a long moment. The wind moved through the dead garden between them, carrying the smell of pine from the distant tree line and the faint metallic bite of coming rain. One of his guards shifted impatiently in his saddle, leather creaking. The Alpha raised one hand, just slightly, and the guard went still. "What is your name?" he asked. "Clara," she said. Of no pack. Another silence. Longer this time. Then he did something none of his guards seemed to expect. He dismounted. Slowly, deliberately, he swung down from the great warhorse and stood on the other side of that broken iron gate, 6 feet of leather and wolf fur and controlled power, and he looked at her across the rust and the weeds with an expression that had changed into something almost unreadable. Not anger, not dismissal, but something careful, like a man reassessing a calculation he had already made. "Come out of the cold," he said. "You will tell me how you came to be here." It was not an invitation, but it was not quite a command either. Clara set down the firewood and walked toward the gate because she was 23 years old, rejected and alone, and she had run out of better options 3 days ago on a road that had led her here, to a ruin full of vines and the impossible gaze of an AlphaKing who had just spoken to her as though her answer actually mattered to him. She did not yet know that what was hidden beneath those vines would change everything. She did not yet know that he already did. His camp was not what Clara had expected. She had imagined, in the brief walk from the ruined gate to the road, something cold and military. Rows of identical tents, guards standing rigid as iron posts, the atmosphere of a march rather than a resting place. What she found instead, tucked into the tree line perhaps a quarter mile from her crumbling property, was something more like a war council mid-breath. 3 large tents of dark oiled canvas stood in a half-circle around a central fire, the flames burning low and steady despite the wind. Horses were tied to a rope line between the pines, their breath rising in pale clouds in the cooling air. 2 guards stood at the perimeter, and a third, a broad-shouldered beta woman with close-cropped dark hair and sharp black eyes, stood near the largest tent with her arms crossed, and an expression that said she had opinions about everything and shared them with no one. That woman's gaze found Clara immediately and did not move. Draven walked ahead without looking back, which somehow felt less like arrogance and more like certainty. The certainty of a man who knew she would follow, because there was nowhere else reasonable to go. He pushed open the flap of the largest tent and held it, waiting. Clara stepped inside. A long map table dominated the center, covered in parchment sheets weighted down with river stones and a dagger driven point first into the wood at one corner. Iron candle holders stood at each end, the candles already burning against the failing daylight outside. The smell of pine resin and candle wax and old leather filled the enclosed space, warmer than the air outside, but only barely. Draven moved to the far side of the table and stood with his hands braced against its edge, looking down at the maps for a moment before looking back up at her. "Sit," he said, nodding toward a camp stool near the tent wall. Clara sat. She kept her back straight, her hands folded in her lap, her face composed. The posture she had learned young, the way an Omega learned to take up as little space as possible and still appear unafraid. Old habit. She was trying to unlearn it. "Describe the merchant," he said. Heavy-set, gray hair at the temples. He wore a blue wool tunic with brass buttons and smelled of pipe smoke and river mud. She paused. "He told me the property had been abandoned for 30 years and that the deed was clear." Draven's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He reached across the table and pulled one of the parchment sheets toward him, turning it so she could see it from her side. It was a territorial map. She recognized the shape of the river valley, the village marks, the forest boundaries. His finger came down on a small parcel near the eastern edge of a larger marked region. "Dravenmore," he said. "My family's land. This specific holding has been under royal seal since my father's time. It cannot be sold, not legally, not by anyone." His blue eyes lifted to hers. "The man who sold it to you was running a swindle. He has done it before." Clara absorbed this. "And the others he swindled?" she asked. "Left when they were told to." He said it without particular emotion, but his gaze stayed on her face, watching. She understood the unspoken question. "I have nowhere to go," she said quietly. Not as a plea, she was done with pleading. Simply as a fact, offered plainly, the way she might report weather. Something in his stillness shifted. He straightened from the table slowly, and for a moment she thought he was going to dismiss her, send her back to the road with an escort and the 3 silver coins she no longer had. Instead, he turned and opened the tent flap. "Sarah," he said. The beta woman appeared immediately, as though she had been standing directly on the other side of the canvas. Up close, her face was harder than Clara had first thought. Not cruel, but built from years of being the person who handled things no one else wanted to handle. There were faint ink stains on her right fingers, and a long-healed scar along her left jawline. "Find her something to eat," Draven said, "and a blanket. She sleeps in the supply tent tonight." He glanced back at Clara once, briefly. "We will speak more in the morning." Then he turned back to his maps, and Clara understood she had been dismissed, but fed and sheltered, which was more than she had been given in 3 days. Sarah studied her with those sharp black eyes for a moment, then made a short sound that was not quite a word, and jerked her head toward the tent exit. Clara followed. Outside, the fire had grown, and 2 of the other guards were crouched near it eating from wooden bowls. Sarah went to a covered iron pot hanging above the coals and ladled out a portion of something that steamed richly, a thick stew of root vegetables and salted meat, the smell of it hitting Clara's empty stomach like a physical blow. She took the bowl with both hands and sat on a log near the fire's edge, and she ate without speaking. And she did not cry, though the warmth of the food and the fire and the simple fact of being given something without being asked to give something in return made the back of her throat ache with the effort of not doing so. Sarah sat across the fire from her, not eating, just watching. "You're an Omega," Sarah said. Not a question. "Yes," Clara said. "Rejected?" Clara looked up from the bowl. The beta's expression was not unkind, exactly. More clinical. The look of someone cataloging information rather than judging it. "Yes," Clara said again. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then, "Who?" "The Alpha of the Greywood Pack." Clara set the bowl down on her knee. "His name was Dorian. He rejected me at the ceremony in front of the entire pack. Said an Omega with no family lineage was unworthy of a pack bond." She said it steadily. She had rehearsed steadiness on the road. 3 days later, I was escorted to the border. Sarah's eyes moved briefly toward the large tent, then back to Clara. Whatever thought had crossed behind them, she kept it. "The house you tried to buy," Sarah said, her voice dropping lower. "The one under the vines." "What about it?" Clara asked. Sarah pressed her lips together. She looked like a woman deciding how much a stranger deserved to know. In the end, she said only, "Ask him in the morning." She stood, picking up a folded wool blanket from beside the supply tent and holding it out. "Sleep. You look like you've been walking for a week." 3 days, Clara said, taking the blanket. "Same thing." Sarah turned away, and the conversation was over. Clara curled onto the canvas floor of the supply tent, with the blanket pulled to her chin and the smell of dried provisions and pine pitch around her. And she stared at the low canvas ceiling and listened to the wind move through the trees outside. She was alive. She was warm. She had eaten. She thought about the vines. She thought about the way Draven's expression had changed, just for a fraction of a second, when she had said the address of the property. Not surprise. Something older than surprise. Something that looked, from a distance, like recognition, like grief. She closed her eyes and told herself it was none of her concern. She was a rejected Omega with 3 missing silver coins, and no pack, and no plan. She could not afford to be curious about an Alpha King's grief. But sleep, when it came, brought her dreams of stone walls beneath thick vines, and somewhere beneath them, something carved that she could not quite see. Letters in a language she almost knew, worn smooth by years of weather and silence and waiting. She woke before dawn with the feeling that the ruin had been trying to tell her something, and that Draven already knew what it was. Morning came gray and cold, the kind of gray that pressed down on the treetops and turned the pine forest into a wall of shadow. Clara woke to the sound of boots on frozen ground and the distant ring of steel, 2 of the guards sparring near the horse line, their breath rising in short white bursts as their blades caught what little light the clouds allowed. She folded the blanket carefully and set it on the supply chest where she had found it. Old habit again, leaving things better than she had found them. The instinct of someone who had spent years trying not to be a burden. She stepped out of the supply tent and found the camp already moving with quiet purpose. The fire rebuilt, an iron kettle hanging above it breathing steam into the cold air. Sarah was at the map table outside the large tent, parchment spread before her, a stick of charcoal in her ink-stained fingers. She did not look up when Clara approached, but she said, "Porridge, iron pot, don't wait to be invited." Clara served herself and stood near the fire eating in silence, watching the camp without appearing to watch it. She had learned that skill young, the art of observing without being seen to observe, of understanding a place by reading its smallest movements. The guards moved with disciplined ease, no wasted motion, no noise beyond what was necessary. They communicated with glances and small gestures more than words. Whatever pack these people belonged to, it was old and tightly bound. Draven emerged from his tent when the porridge was still warm in her bowl. He had clearly been awake for some time. The maps under his arm were already marked with fresh ink, and there was a tension in the set of his jaw that had not been there the night before. Something that had grown in the hours of darkness. fed by thoughts she had no access to. He wore the same leather armor, rebuckled with precision. His black braids pushed back from his face and retied. The wolf fur cloak settled across his shoulders against the morning cold. He looked at her once, directly, the way he seemed to do everything, without hesitation, without pretense. "Walk with me," he said. It was not, again, quite a command. But his boots were already moving toward the tree line, and Clara set down her bowl and followed. They walked in silence for several minutes, moving along a narrow path through the pines that gradually descended toward the river valley below. The ground was soft with fallen needles and yesterday's rain, muffling their footsteps. The smell of cold earth and pine resin was thick and clean. Somewhere above the clouds, a pale sun was attempting to exist. Then the trees thinned, and Clara saw the house again. From this angle, approaching from the eastern slope rather than the road, it looked different, larger than she had first understood. What she had taken for a simple abandoned cottage was, she now saw, the remnant of something considerably more substantial. The vines had disguised the true size of the structure. She could see now the outline of a second room extending behind the first, still roofed, and beyond that, the collapsed suggestion of what might once have been a small courtyard, its stone walls still standing to shoulder height on three sides. Draven stopped at the edge of the slope and stood looking at it, with his hands clasped behind his back, and that expression on his face again, the one she had glimpsed the night before. Up close and in daylight she could read it more clearly. It was grief, quiet, old, and fully owned. The grief of a man who had long since accepted a wound without accepting the loss that made it. "What is this place?" Clara asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "My mother was born here." She had not expected that. She kept her face still. "She was an Omega," he continued, his voice carrying the same low, measured quality as always, but with something underneath it now, something that moved slowly, like water beneath ice. "From a village family. No title, no lineage. My father found her in a winter storm, half frozen on this road. He brought her inside." He paused. He never left. Clara looked at the house, at the vines covering it, at the dark gap of the warped door. "She died," she said. Not a question. The grief was too settled to belong to someone still living. 12 years ago. He turned his head slightly, not quite looking at her. "After she was gone, my father sealed the property under royal authority, said no one should live where she had lived, that it would remain hers." A brief silence. He died 4 years later. The seal remained. Clara understood now why no legal merchant could have sold her this land. She also understood something else. Something about the way he had looked at her across that rusted gate with that particular unreadable expression. An Omega, alone, on his mother's land. "I will return your 3 silver coins," he said. "I don't want them back," Clara said. He looked at her then. Fully, directly, the way that made the back of her neck feel warm despite the cold air. "What do you want?" he asked. It was such a simple question. She could not remember the last time anyone had asked it as though her answer might genuinely alter something. "I want to restore it," she said. She heard the words leave her mouth and knew they were true even as she said them, even though they surprised her. "The house. I want to clear the vines and repair the walls and make it something again." She held his gaze, because she was done looking away. "I know it isn't mine legally. I know I have no claim. But I've been walking for 3 days and I've slept in ditches and I spent my last coins on something that turned out to be a lie and that house is still standing and I..." She stopped. Steadied herself. "I know how to work. I'm not asking for charity." The wind moved between them, carrying the smell of coming rain again. Draven looked at her for a long time. long enough that one of the distant guards glanced toward them from the tree line, with a carefully neutral expression. "You said you are of no pack," he said at last. "Not anymore. Who rejected you?" "An alpha named Dorian, of the Greywood pack." She said it without flinching, because she had decided on the road that she would not flinch from it anymore. "He said I had nothing worth bonding to." Something moved in Draven's blue eyes. Not pity. She would have closed herself off immediately from pity. It was something colder and more controlled than pity. Something that looked underneath the control, very much like anger on her behalf. He looked back at the house. "I will have my guards clear the main path," he said finally, "and bring tools from the nearest village." A pause, the kind of pause that held a decision being finalized. "You may stay, on the property, under royal protection." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "No one will trouble you here." Clara's chest did something complicated and involuntary. She pressed it flat. "Why?" she asked quietly. He glanced at her sideways. "Because my mother would have offered you the same." He turned and walked back toward the camp before she could respond, his wolf fur cloak moving behind him like a shadow given weight. Clara stood alone at the edge of the slope and looked at the ruined house. Her ruined house, at least in the only way that mattered to her now, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not the hollow snap of a broken bond. Something else. Something quieter and more dangerous. Because it felt like the beginning of something, rather than the end. She did not notice in that moment that she had stopped shaking. She also did not notice Sarah standing 20 paces behind her in the tree line, watching the whole exchange with sharp black eyes and an expression that was, for the first time since Clara had arrived, something very close to approval. And she did not see what Sarah saw. That Draven, halfway back to camp, had stopped walking for just a moment, his back to both of them. His head turned very slightly as though listening for a sound he had not heard in a long time. Then he walked on. But the pause had been there, and Sarah, who had served him for 11 years and knew every line of him, had never seen it before. The vines came down slowly. Clara worked from the eastern wall first, pulling the thick ropes of growth away from the stone with her bare hands until her palms were raw and stained dark green, then switching to the short iron blade one of Draven's guards had left beside the gate, without a word, the morning after her conversation on the slope. She worked in silence, and the silence suited her. The scratch and tear of ancient vine stems, the occasional soft collapse of dried thatch, the steady percussion of wind through the pines. These sounds asked nothing of her, and she gave nothing back, only the work. By the second day, she had cleared the eastern wall entirely. What she found beneath the vines stopped her cold. The stone was old, far older than the rest of the house, she thought, the blocks a different color and texture than those above the foundation. And carved into the surface, at roughly the height of a person's heart, was a symbol she almost recognized. A circle, incomplete, broken at the top, with 2 lines descending from its base like roots. Worn by weather, and years until the edges were soft, but unmistakably deliberate. Someone had carved it with care. Someone who had wanted it to last. She ran her fingers over it slowly, tracing the curved line of the incomplete circle, the twin roots descending into the stone. Behind her, she heard boots on the garden path, and knew without turning who it was. Draven had come each morning since the 3rd day, not to speak particularly, but to observe, standing at the gate or along the low courtyard wall, with his arms folded and his blue eyes moving over her progress, with an expression she was slowly learning to read. Not supervision, something more like witnessing. "What does this mean?" she asked without turning. He was quiet for long enough that she did finally turn. He was standing closer than she had expected, just behind her left shoulder. looking at the carved symbol with an expression that had gone very still in a way that was different from his usual controlled stillness. This was the stillness of something unexpected. "Where did you find this?" he said. "Under the vines, eastern wall, about 3 feet from the foundation corner." She looked back at the carving. It was covered completely. Nothing could have seen it from the outside. He crouched slowly, bringing himself level with the carving, and reached out to touch it the same way she had, one finger tracing the broken circle, the descending lines. Up this close she could see the tension in his jaw, the slight tightening around his eyes. "It is the old Omega mark," he said quietly. "Before the packs formalized their rankings, before it became a hierarchy." He paused. "In my grandfather's time, this symbol meant sanctuary, a place where any Omega could come without fear and not be turned away." Clara looked at the stone, at the careful, worn lines of it. "Your mother carved this," she said. It was not quite a question. His silence confirmed it more completely than words would have. He stood after a moment, brushing stone dust from his fingers, and looked at the house with that old grief settling back into place across his features, like a cloak he had worn so long he no longer noticed its weight. "She spoke of it sometimes," he said. "A mark she had made before my father found her, before she became queen." A pause. "She said that if she ever disappeared from the world, that mark would still be here. Proof she had existed. Proof she had believed in something." Clara felt the words land somewhere deep and quiet inside her. She thought of her own 3 silver coins, spent on a lie. She thought of standing in front of a pack of people who had watched without a word while a man told her she was worth nothing. She thought of the 3 days on the road, and the cold ditches, and the way desperation could drive a person toward the most unlikely door. She thought that perhaps doors had a way of being exactly the right ones, even when they looked like ruins. "I will restore it," she said. "The mark. When I repair the wall, I will restore it exactly as it is." Draven looked at her. Something moved in his expression that she could not fully catch before he controlled it. Something sudden and unguarded, gone almost before it arrived. "Yes," he said, simply, as though she had answered a question he had not known he was carrying. It was Sarah who told her about the merchant. 4 days into Clara's work on the house, the beta appeared at the garden gate in the late afternoon, with 2 clay cups of heated cider and the expression of a woman who had decided something. She handed 1 cup to Clara without preamble and leaned against the gate post and looked at the cleared eastern wall with its newly visible stone. "His name is Aldrich," Sarah said, "the merchant who sold you the deed." Clara wrapped both hands around the warm cup. "You found him?" "He was found." Sarah's voice was flat. "He has done this before, selling sealed royal properties to travelers passing through Ashfen. People with no local knowledge, no pack connections, no one to tell them the land was untouchable." She glanced at Clara sideways. "People who wouldn't be missed if they were chased off." The cider was sweet and warm with cloves and dried apple, and Clara drank it slowly, processing. "What will happen to him?" she asked. "He is being brought before the royal steward at Drivenmore Keep." Sarah said it without visible satisfaction, which somehow made it more final. "Draven sent riders the morning after you arrived." Clara looked into her cup. "He did that the next morning?" "Before breakfast," Sarah said. The gatepost creaked softly in the wind. From the pine forest came the distant sound of the sparring guards, steel on steel in the cold afternoon air. Clara thought about a man who had sentenced a swindler to justice before he had finished deciding whether to let her stay. "Sarah," she said carefully, "what is he like? As a king?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, turning her own cup in her ink-stained hands. "Precise," she said at last. He sees everything, decides quickly, and rarely changes his mind once it is made. A pause. He has not changed his mind about you. What do you mean? Sarah looked at her with those sharp black eyes that cataloged everything and revealed only what they chose to. I mean that an Omega arrived on his mother's land with a fraudulent deed and 3 missing silver coins, and instead of sending her back to the road, he ordered tools from the village, had the path cleared, and has come to this gate every morning for 4 days. She pushed off the gatepost. Draw your own conclusions. She collected Clara's empty cup without being asked, and walked back toward the camp, leaving Clara standing in the cold garden with the taste of cloves on her tongue and a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the cider. She found the second carving on the 5th day. It was inside the house this time, on the interior face of the fireplace, hidden behind a loose stone she had been meaning to replace. When she pried the stone free, a folded piece of oilskin fell from the gap behind it, old and darkened but intact, still sealed against the years by whatever careful hands had placed it there. Her own hands were trembling again as she unfolded it. It was a letter, written in a clean, careful hand, the hand of someone educated, precise, deeply feeling. The ink had faded to brown but remained entirely legible. It began without a name and ended without a signature, because it had not been written for a stranger to find. It had been written for one specific person. If you have found this, then the house is still standing, and that means something survived. I do not know who you are or how you came to be here, but I know you are here because you needed to be. I know this because I was the same. I arrived at this door with nothing, and the door opened anyway. Take care of the mark on the eastern wall. It is older than both of us. It says, "You are safe here." I believed it once. I believe it still. Whatever drove you to this door, let it be the last thing that breaks you. From here you build. Clara sat on the cold stone floor of the old house with the letter in her hands, and the empty hearth before her, and the gray winter light coming through the cleared window frames. And she did not manage, this time, to hold back the tears. She did not hear the soft sound of boots stopping at the threshold. She did not hear Draven's quiet breath, or see the way his hand rose to the doorframe and rested there, not entering, only present, watching a woman he had known for 5 days cry over a letter his mother had written 20 years ago for exactly this moment. He did not speak. He did not leave. He simply stayed. He stayed until her breathing steadied. Clara became aware of his presence gradually, the particular quality of stillness that belonged only to him, the faint smell of leather and pine resin and cold air that preceded him like a quiet announcement. She did not startle. She folded the letter carefully along its original creases and held it against her chest and looked at the empty hearth until she was certain her voice would hold. She wrote it for whoever came next, Clara said. Yes, Draven said from the threshold. His voice was low and careful, the way a person speaks near something fragile without acknowledging its fragility directly. She knew someone would come. She believed someone would. He paused. There is a difference, for people like her. She did not deal in certainty. She dealt in faith. Clara turned to look at him. He was standing exactly where she had imagined, one hand resting on the old doorframe, not entering, his blue eyes on her face with that expression she had spent 5 days learning and still could not entirely name. The gray light through the window fell across the scar on his cheekbone and the dark braids framing his jaw and the wolf fur cloak heavy on his shoulders, and he looked, in that moment, less like a king than like a man standing at the edge of something he was not certain he was permitted to enter. She held the letter out toward him. He crossed the threshold. Then, finally, his boots quiet on the stone floor, and he took the letter from her hands with a carefulness that made her throat tighten. He did not read it. He simply held it, looking down at the faded brown ink, at his mother's careful handwriting preserved in oilskin for 2 decades, waiting for exactly this. His jaw moved once. He controlled whatever rose behind it with the practiced ease of a man who had long ago built strong walls around the places where he was softest. She was right, Clara said quietly, about the door. He looked up from the letter. It was the last thing that broke me, she said. Standing on that road with a fraudulent deed and nowhere left to go. That was the bottom of it. She held his gaze steadily, and then the door opened anyway. Something shifted in his expression, not the sudden, unguarded flicker she had caught before, but something slower and deeper, like a tide turning. He folded the letter along its creases, the same way she had, and held it back out to her. "Keep it," he said. "It belongs to you," she said. "She was your mother. She wrote it for you." His voice was very quiet. She wrote it for whoever needed it most. That was always how she thought. He pressed the letter into her hands gently, and his fingers were warm against her cold ones for just a moment before he stepped back. "Keep it." Clara closed her fingers around the oilskin. The news arrived the following morning, and it was not good. Sarah brought it herself, appearing at the garden gate before Clara had finished clearing the frost from the courtyard stones, her expression set in hard, closed lines that Clara had come to recognize as the beta's version of controlled alarm. "Aldrich talked," Sarah said. "The merchant. Before the steward, he gave names. He was not working alone." Clara set down her iron scraper. "Who was he working with?" "A man named Cresswell, a minor noble from the Eastern Territories, who has been quietly acquiring sealed properties through fraud for 3 years. Sarah's black eyes were sharp and steady. "He has filed a formal claim with the regional council, asserting that Dravenmoor's eastern holdings, including this land, were improperly sealed after the late Queen's death. He is arguing the seal has no legal standing." Clara understood immediately. "He wants the land. He wants all of it. 12 properties total. This one is the smallest." Sarah paused, "But it is the one Draven will not surrender. Because of his mother. Because of what it represents." Sarah's voice dropped slightly. "Cresswell knows that. He is using it deliberately, filing the claim publicly, forcing Draven to defend the seal before the regional council or appear to abandon his mother's legacy. Either way, Draven is pulled into a political dispute that costs him time, attention, and goodwill he needs elsewhere." Clara looked at the eastern wall. At the cleared stone, the restored lines of the old Omega mark. She had spent 2 evenings carefully retracing it with a fine chisel, following each worn groove back to its original depth. "When does the council convene?" she asked. 6 days. "And what does Draven need to prove his mother's seal was valid?" Sarah studied her with those cataloging eyes. A witness to the original sealing. A record of intent. Something that demonstrates the property was sealed under legitimate royal authority, with the Queen's own knowledge and consent. She paused. "The Royal Archive has the seal document, but Cresswell's advocate will argue it was made under duress after her death, not by her will during her life." Clara looked down at the folded oilskin letter in her apron pocket. She had kept it close since yesterday, the way you keep something that has become important before you fully understand why. "Would her own words be sufficient?" Clara asked carefully. "Written in her own hand, demonstrating her intent for this property, her belief in what it stood for." Sarah went very still. "That letter," she said, "she wrote it before she died. In this house. She intended for this place to stand as sanctuary. She said so plainly, in her own words, in her own hand." Clara met Sarah's gaze. "If her handwriting can be verified against other known documents in the Royal Archive." "It can," Sarah said, and she was already moving toward the large tent before the sentence was finished. Draven read the letter again that evening, slowly this time, in full. Sitting across the map table from Clara, with 2 candles burning between them and Sarah, standing at his right shoulder, reading over him with her arms folded and her jaw tight. When he finished, he set the letter on the table and was quiet for a long moment. "She planned this," he said at last, not with bitterness, with something that was almost wonder. "She planned for the possibility," Clara said. She could not have known when or who, but she left the evidence where it would be found by someone who was looking, someone who cared enough about the house to clear the walls and pull out the loose stones. She paused. She trusted that person would come. Draven looked at her across the candlelight. The flames caught the blue of his eyes and held there, and in the warm, unsteady light, he looked younger than his authority suggested. Not diminished, but present in a way that power sometimes prevented. "You came here with nothing," he said quietly. "And you gave me back something I did not know I had lost." "Your mother gave it back," Clara said. "I only found it." "Clara." He said her name like it had weight, like he had been considering the weight of it for some time. "When this is resolved, when Cresswell is answered and the council is satisfied, I would ask something of you." She waited. "Stay," he said, "not under royal protection as a charity, not as a guest." He held her gaze without flinching. "Restore the house. Make it what she intended it to be. A sanctuary for those who arrive at broken gates with nowhere left to go." A pause, careful and deliberate. "And let me come to this gate. Not as a king checking on royal property." His voice dropped, low and certain. "As a man who would very much like the chance to know you." The candles flickered between them in the draft from the tent wall. Clara thought of Dorian's voice in front of the pack. Worth nothing. No lineage. No place here. She thought of 3 days on a cold road, and a fraudulent deed, and a rusted gate, and a house drowned in vines. She thought of an incomplete circle carved into stone by a woman who had arrived at her own broken door with nothing and had chosen anyway to believe. "Yes," she said. Cresswell's claim collapsed before the regional council in less than 1 session. The letter was verified against 3 known documents bearing the late Queen's signature in the Royal Archive. Her handwriting was unmistakable, distinctive, precise, deeply personal. The council's senior arbiter read her words aloud in the chamber, and the room was very quiet afterward, the way rooms become when something true has been spoken in a place accustomed to cleverness. Cresswell's advocate offered 2 more arguments, and abandoned both when Draven presented the archive records alongside a full accounting of the fraudulent deeds Aldrich had sold over 3 years. Each one traceable, through witnesses and ink records, back to Cresswell's own seal. The minor noble from the Eastern Territories was stripped of his titles before the session ended. He left the council chamber a smaller man than he had entered it, and he did not look back. Aldrich was sentenced to 5 years of labor service under the royal steward's authority, restitution to every person he had defrauded, and permanent prohibition from any merchant activity in the 7 territories. He accepted the sentence without protest, which Sarah said meant he had expected worse. The Eastern holdings remained under royal seal, every one of them. The house was finished by the first breath of spring. Clara had spent the winter months working steadily, repairing the thatch roof with bundles of fresh reed, remortaring the cracked foundation stones with a mixture she learned from the village mason, replacing the warped door with solid oak fitted precisely to its frame, clearing the courtyard and planting the small garden with herbs she knew from memory. Rosemary, lavender, winter thyme, the flat-leafed variety of sage that grew best in rocky soil. The eastern wall stood clean and whole, and at heart height, the omega mark was fully restored, each line retraced to its original depth, the broken circle and its descending roots as deliberate and clear as the day the Queen had carved them. Draven came to the gate often, sometimes to help. He was surprisingly capable with stonework, which Sarah explained by saying simply that his mother had insisted all her children learn to build things as well as command them. Sometimes only to talk, leaning on the gatepost in the early evening with the smell of wood smoke rising from Clara's newly functional hearth. speaking of small things and large ones without distinction. The way people speak when they are becoming genuinely known to each other. Sarah came too, most mornings, with the particular energy of a woman who had adopted a project she would not officially acknowledge. She brought Clara books from the Keep's library, histories of the old Omega traditions, herbalist manuscripts, records of the sanctuary houses that had existed before the pack hierarchy had formalized and reduced everything. She sat at the newly leveled table and read alongside Clara in companionable silence, occasionally reading a passage aloud with the flat affect of someone pretending they were not moved by it. She was, always, moved by it. In the late days of winter, before the thaw, 3 travelers arrived at the gate within the same fortnight. An Omega girl of 22, fleeing a forced pack assignment, a widowed beta woman with a young child and nowhere to shelter, and an elderly Gamma man who had been displaced when his village was absorbed into a neighboring territory. Clara took them all in. She fed them from her stores, gave them the second room she had restored, let them stay until they had rested and planned and found their footing again. When Draven saw the lamp burning in the second room one evening and asked about it, she told him simply, "Your mother was right. The door should open." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the lamplight through the repaired window. Then he said, "I will send provisions from the keep, whatever the sanctuary needs. You don't have to." "I know," he said, and his eyes came to hers across the early spring air, warm and certain, and carrying everything he did not yet say aloud. But that had been building steadily since the first morning on the slope, when he had looked at a woman standing her ground in a dead garden and felt something old and quiet shift inside him. "I want to." On the morning of the spring equinox, Draven arrived at the gate not in his wolf fur cloak and leather armor, but in a simpler dark tunic, his braids loose and pushed back, a small bundle of dried lavender in his hand that he had clearly picked himself from somewhere along the road and was holding with slightly less than his usual composure. Clara was in the garden, pressing rosemary seedlings into the turned earth, and she looked up at him and understood immediately from the particular quality of his stillness, not the controlled stillness of authority, but the stillness of a man standing at the edge of something important, that this was not a usual morning visit. She stood and brushed the earth from her hands. He opened the gate and came to her, and he held out the lavender, and she took it, and the smell of it rose between them in the cool spring air, clean and sweet, and full of the particular promise that belongs only to the season when things begin again. "I have something to ask you," he said, "and I want to ask it here." "Here," she said softly, understanding. On his mother's land, at the gate that had opened for an Omega arriving with nothing. Beneath the spring sky, with the restored house behind her, and the Omega mark visible on the clean eastern wall, and the small garden coming back to life in the turned earth at their feet. He reached into the fold of his tunic and produced a ring. Simple, old, unmistakably personal. A band of dark iron set with a single stone the color of deep water, threaded on a worn leather cord that spoke of long keeping. "This was hers," he said. "She told my father once that she wanted it to go to someone who came through a hard door and chose to stay anyway." His blue eyes held hers, steady and warm and entirely without the armor he wore everywhere else. "I cannot think of anyone it belongs to more." Clara looked at the ring, at the man holding it, at the house behind her, repaired, lit, open, alive in ways that a ruin drowning in vines could never have predicted. She thought of the letter. "From here, you build." She held out her hand. He placed the ring in her palm, and then his hand closed over hers, warm and certain, and they stood together in the spring garden of a house that had been waiting 20 years for exactly this, for an Omega to arrive at a broken gate with nothing left to lose and everything still possible, and for a king who had been grieving in silence to finally let something grow again in the space where grief had lived. In the years that followed, the sanctuary house on the eastern road of Dravenmoor became known throughout the 7 territories. Travelers spoke of it the way people speak of places that seem to find you, rather than the other way around. A house with an old mark on its eastern wall, a lamp always burning in the window, a woman with a long blonde braid and careful hands who opened the door before you finished knocking. Sarah retired from active royal service and took up permanent residence in the village, appearing at the sanctuary most mornings with ink on her fingers and strong opinions about the herb garden that Clara had learned to value enormously. She wrote down the histories of the old Omega sanctuaries in careful records that she donated to the Royal Archive, insisting without sentiment that such things should not be forgotten again. Draven ruled Dravenmoor with the same precision and controlled authority as before, and those who knew him well noted that he was somewhat less contained than he had once been, that he laughed occasionally in public, that he had stopped wearing his grief like armor. He came to the sanctuary house every evening that duty allowed, and on the evenings he could not come, Clara saw the lamp lit in the high window of the keep across the valley. A signal they had settled on without quite discussing it, the way people who are becoming essential to each other establish small, quiet languages that belong only to them. The Omega mark on the eastern wall weathered through spring and summer and the following winter and emerged the same, the broken circle, the descending roots, the old word carved in stone by a queen who had arrived at her own broken door with nothing and had believed anyway. It remained, as she had intended, proof that she had existed, proof that she had believed in something, and now, at last, proof that she had been right.